I meant to say when I introduced Anthony Dowell in September, apart from anything else, it was a treat for me because, of course, I began as a fan and I stood at the stage door for Anthony Dowell after so many performances. Well, it's the same today with Merle Park. She was my first Juliet, my first Aurora, my first Manon. Of course, I was at the premieres of Mayerling, La Fin du Jour, Isadora, all of those ballets, others too. There was a photograph somewhere of me in my archives at the stage door with Merle Park signing my program. And before that, when I was still in my teens at school, I wasn't serious about ballet. I was really crazy about theater and about opera. And so living as a boy in the country, I'm a farmer's son, I'd watch whatever came on television. There was a broadcast in 1973, which Merle doesn't remember at all, but it was a gala to celebrate, ready yourself for this, fanfare for Europe, to Britain joining the European Union. And they danced a new pas de deux made maybe 4 or 5 months before, Walk to the Paradise Garden. And for me, a romantic 17-year-old, it was just the blast of beauty and lyricism that took my breath away. I had not known that ballet could be like this. I suspect it was the first Ashton choreography I had ever seen. So it is a double treat for me. It's fascinating also for another reason, that this is a hard pas de deux for the powers that be you're going to see this afternoon to reconstruct. Because though there is this film made for I think the BBC, for that Fanfare for Europe broadcast gala, and I've seen that 10, 15 years ago in one of those evenings organized by Jane Pritchard at the BFI, the National Film Theatre. It is hell for the average person to get hold of, including anybody at the Royal Ballet. So there are, I think, 2 films of Walk to the Paradise Garden to work from, one of which I gather is very dark and pretty off the music. That was the basis for Desmond Kelly using when he reconstructed Walk to the Paradise Garden for the Birmingham Royal Ballet. Was it 15 years ago? I can't quite remember the year. I remember going. And I remember hearing him talk afterwards saying, well, we did the best we could, but there was a section so dark I truly had to choreograph it myself because you couldn't see what the dancers are doing. And now it turns out there is another film taken by Merle Park's husband at either the premiere or the dress rehearsal for the premiere. It is the dress rehearsal, yes, I know why you're going to see a particular dress rehearsal moment at the end of it. I haven't seen it yet myself. And this is the basis for today's reconstruction. But with any film, and it's true for so many, the hardest thing to work on is musicality. Because quite often, if you've been in the theater and you really know how a dancer moves to the music, the way somehow television or whatever catches it can get it just a little blur off the music. So it's invaluable to have a member of the original cast showing them how to feel the music, what to listen for, how to work with it. Another reason why today is important is the sheer history of Merle Park in the Royal Ballet and to do with Frederick Ashton. She danced Ashton choreography for almost 30 years. She joined in the late 50s, the Royal Ballet. She was doing supporting roles in the premiere of Ondine, 1958. She created, I think, the last completely new piece that he ever made, which is La Chatte métamorphosée en femme, solo, in 1985. That's almost 30 years. It's phenomenal. Still when she was new to the company in the early 50s, she was put on in solo roles like the milkmaid in Facade in her teens, quickly moved up through repertory like that. When I spoke last time, I pointed out that there are what I would call 7 phases of Ashton's career. And I'll take you through them again. The first is really when he's just learning his craft. From 1926, Tragedy of Fashion, through the Rambert years, through the revue and music hall years, up to 1933 when he makes Les Rendezvous. Ballets like Capriole Suite, Facade come from that period. And he's not yet a fully classical choreography. He's just a supreme craftsman, fabulously entertaining. Les Rendezvous, I think, is a breakthrough, and that takes us into his second phase, and that's when he starts to become a truly classical choreographer, a master of classical steps. And this includes this period right through the rest of the 30s. Les Patineurs is the best known of the other ballets. Of course, he made Apparitions, which is about to be reconstructed in Sarasota, Florida sometime this season anyway. Wedding Bouquet, which many of you will know quite well, and lost ballets like Nocturne, and many others. Then comes the war, and up to 1939, Ashton has seemed quite a lightweight choreographer, charming, brilliant, but not everybody thought he had depth. And when the war broke up, he turned to his friend Constant Lambert, the music director of the company, and said, okay, you and I are going to read the Bible aloud, and when we finish doing so, the war will be over. Of course, that wasn't true. And they found themselves reading other books of spiritual content, or Ashton in particular he did. It was his oasis of thought to go to during the dark years of the war. It's why he makes the darkest ballets he'd ever made up to that point, like Dante's Sonata, The Wise Virgins, then The Wanderer and The Quest. Ashton is always Ashton, though, and in that dark period, when he enters a new seriousness, he can't help it. He revises Facade, and he puts in my favorite dance in Facade of all, the Foxtrot for Two Couples. That's made in 1944. Then the fourth period, which for many people was the greatest period of all, certainly the one that put him among the world-leading choreographers, is when the company moves to Covent Garden, 1946. Straight away, he works on his first ballet on the Covent Garden stage, Symphonic Variations, and it is a new statement of classicism. Who in the room has not seen Symphonic Variations? I'm preaching to the converted, aren't I? You don't need me at all. With this, he achieved what everybody could recognize as a voice in classical ballet to equal Fokine and Balanchine, as well as the masters of the 19th century. And he goes on, he's working now with a new confidence in 20th century music. So often, Ashton takes comfort in what I call 19th century honky-tonk, fun, fabulous dance music by Meyerbeer, Herold, Aubert, minor 19th century music with fabulous rhythms, fabulous beats, that he has such musicality that he makes us love. But in this period, he is now working, he's contradicting Constant Lambert, who doesn't want symphonic music. Constant Lambert didn't want César Franck's music for Symphonic Variations. Ashton says, nonetheless, I must insist. I've been listening to it throughout the war. I know how it will work. Lambert watches the ballet and says, you were right, I was wrong. Ashton then goes on, he choreographs Prokofiev's Cinderella when it's only a very few years old. He choreographs Ravel's Valse Noble et Sentimentale. He goes into a whole series of Benjamin Britten ballets. And William Walton. He'd already worked with Walton in the 30s, but this kind of new confidence with relatively new music. Stravinsky's Scène de Ballet, only 4 years old. Which still to this day, with those grinding opening chords, is tough music for many people in the audience. Ashton was hungry for it, and he loved straight away the complicated rhythms. That extraordinary period of new maturity comes to an end in the early 50s when his two closest artistic associates die. One is Constant Lambert. The other is his main designer, Sophie Fedorovich. And I remember Ashton saying on television in one documentary, it was as if the ground had opened under my feet. And I was lucky he spoke to me about Sophie Fedorovich. She was his great friend, not just because she was his designer and they laughed together, but because she bullied him. She would watch all of his choreography and say, why is that there? Why is that there? And just make him pare away until he learnt to take away everything that seemed extraneous, which got so much into his brain that long after her death, he would be looking at his own ballet saying, you know, there's just too much of that. I want to pare away, make it simpler. And in retirement, people would find him thinking, I'm just thinking of all my ballets, how too complicated they are. They should all be reduced. We're grateful he didn't pursue some of that, but that was the nature of the mind there. Nonetheless, he works through the rest of the 50s. Of course, Fontaine is there. She's now the most famous dancer in the world. He makes ballets to show off her technique as a staggering prima ballerina. Sylvia, probably the most taxing ballet ever made for her. Birthday Offering, still an absolute tongue twister for the feet, if you can forgive me mixing my metaphors. And then Sheng the lyrical side of her in the three-act Ondine at the end of the 50s. She comes to what seems like retirement. She stops dancing Swan Lake in the late 50s. And though, of course, he went on presenting her through the 60s and choreographing for her, actually in the 70s and once or two occasion pieces in the 80s, really the main part of their partnership now ended. And since he had made so many ballets for her, and she could walk into a ballet that hadn't been made on her, like Cinderella, and make it yet greater with her extraordinary theatricality, you would think that this would be a crisis again for his career. Instead, he turns to Nadia Narina, Svetlana Beryosova, Antoinette Sibley, Merle Park, Lynn Seymour, and out comes this flood of extraordinary ballets from the 60s, as if it's a release. It begins with Female Gardée, probably his best known, probably his best loved, and the most, this is a boring word, but we have to use it, English of all his ballets. It is the ballet that makes many people in the audience feel that they are at home, that this is the world that they've grown up in. I'm a farmer's son from East Anglia, so I really feel that way. It's an extraordinary decade for him. He begins it as assistant director, assistant to Ninette de Valois. He's already making a lot of the decisions in the early 1960s. Then he becomes director of the Royal Ballet. Forgive me if I told this story 2 months ago, but I think it's important that I was a very nervous interviewer for him in my 20s and had a list of questions all written down. And I bullied him to allowing me to interview him just before his 80th birthday. He was very grudging. The amazing thing is once you got him, he then gave you extraordinary full value. I look back on the people I've interviewed, including Tom Stoppard, Harold Pinter, Merce Cunningham, Mark Morris. And Fred really was the person who gave you the freshest thought of all I've ever interviewed. And sometimes there'd be a very long pause, and you thought, oh, that was the wrong question, wasn't it? And then suddenly out would come a bombshell. Absolutely fresh mind, as if it had all been coming to the surface of his mind. And we've touched on Balanchine, who had died the year before. And I thought I've said the wrong thing because there was a pause. And then Fred said, I wouldn't have called him Fred, of course, in those days. One just refers to him now as Fred. How are things over there? Because he knew I went to New York now and then. So I said, well, the company, New York City Ballet, is dancing sensationally. It's as if they're completely in his spirit now that he's dead. And I don't know why I didn't make predictions then, and I don't now as a rule, but that was an exception. I said, I think it's going to last for 5 years with everybody on a wave dancing as if they're in Balanchine's head, and then I think it could crumble, who knows. Silence from Ashton. So I thought, oh, well, what do I do? I thought, dig myself deeper, I suppose. So I said, it's been so extraordinary to have a great classical company that is entirely one man's vision, that everything is shaped by everything, fifth position, port de bras, by how one man, George Balanchine, saw things. So I thought, I'm really saying the wrong thing now, aren't I? And then Ashton didn't leave a silence at all. He just said, that's how it's got to be. That's how it's got to be. That's how it was when I ran the Royal Ballet. I wasn't just interested in my own ballets. I took those girls down the ramp in Bayadere. I looked after the new ballets. You've really got to link the whole style of the company into a continuity. And it made sense as soon as he said it, because I remember in an earlier interview that he'd given me in 1980, I'd complimented on how his ballets were connected to the 19th century repertory and to the Diaghilev repertory. And he said, that's what Kasavina said to me. She looked at my work and she said, you were a link in the chain. And that's how he saw his place within the repertory. And he would look at younger choreographers, I think, and take ideas and say, oh, they're moving that way, and start to make a new style himself, or develop his existing style. All of this comes to an end in 1970, really because in 1968, the powers that be, despite him, announced that he would no longer be the director of the Royal Ballet after 1970, and that he would be replaced. Everybody would react to such a decision in a different way. Ashton reacted in his own way, which was to go into a monstrous sulk. It was announced that he would make a ballet a year from then on. He didn't. He made the odd divertissement, odd gala item, including, we're happy to say, Walk to the Paradise Garden. But it was a breakthrough when in 1976 he did create one full ballet, Month of the Country. After that, he really only made, I suppose, 2 more, Rhapsody in 1980, Vari Capricci in 1983. The rest were all really divertissements, fabulous, and often showing that his art, his craft, was still developing. I remember Mary Clark reviewing the premiere of Month of the Country, and there he was, 71, almost 72 years old, and she said, I have to insist his craft is still maturing. You could see ways in which Month of the Country goes beyond anything he'd yet done before. And we're talking just about the craft of making dances. If you analyze some of the dances in Month of the Country, how they fit the music, they're yet more sophisticated than what he had done. Extraordinary. And on that note, in a way, that's the end of Ashton's career. Merle Park, he dies in 1988. And I was working in New York at the time. I remember being rang up at about 6 in the morning by a friend to break to me this tragic news, and I had to ring all my New York friends. And of course, New York was where Ashton was so much loved. The last thing he said to me when I saw him in February 1988, by the way, was, oh, lucky you going to New York. Do have a vodka martini for me. Only they know how to make them. And it was the first drink I had in New York was for him, that vodka martini. Well, it wasn't just one of them, to be truthful. And of course, he insisted that he was yet better appreciated in New York. And sometimes, working there now, I feel that that's still true. There's a large contingent of the New York audience that just is at home with the dance values that Ashton put on stage. I wish I could quite explain it. I think it's really because despite the terrific difference between Balanchine and Ashton, they're actually more related than they are different. And that they put dancing at the center of their works, and classical dancing most of the time. But Merle Park fits into this because she's danced ballets in just about all of the 7 periods I mentioned. I'm not sure she danced anything from the war years, but she certainly danced Facade, I think 3 of the leading roles in it. The Milkmaid's her first. I remember her as the debutante. In between that, she danced the polka. Rendezvous, she was famous in the lead ballerina role, but there's a film, and I mention this because this is the Ashton Foundation. We've all got to keep researching little-known Ashton. At one point, Ashton decided to change Les Rendezvous, and he doubled the corps de ballet and reorganized the larger groupings. And I don't know if there's any film around in Covent Garden, but there is in the New York Public Library Dance Division. It doesn't have music. It's with Nadia Narina and Brian Shaw doing the lead roles, and Merle Park is leading the pas de trois. I think the pas de quatre of Little Girls includes people like Doreen Wells and Antoinette Sibley. It's fantastic to watch. Of course, they are all such masters of Ashton style dancing around 1960. And what's fascinating to see is how Les Rendezvous changes when it has a larger corps de ballet, fits the Covent Garden stage sensationally. You can see why he wanted to experiment with this new way. And I believe, frankly, it's better than the Rendezvous even we know. I think a lot of people around Ashton, not least Michael Soames, were very conservative and said, let's go back to the one we know, let's go back to the smaller one. If you can watch this film the next time you're in New York, see if you agree. And it's a different world from the Rendezvous, by the way, we know. Instead of having that gateway at the back, there are steps going down at the back. The film is from a dress rehearsal, so you do see stagehands walking across every so often looking at what's going on. But there are steps going down, so when all those exits that go at the back of the stage have a completely new quality, and there are chandeliers hanging as if it's a pavilion at night. I think that's how, because I say it's a dress rehearsal, so it's a little hard for me to be sure. Anyway, I slightly sidetrack. Merle Park is all part of that ballet. She was the second cast female garde, and remember, whenever you look at the Cat's Cradle scene in the first act, first scene, that Ashton, in his way, this is so Ashton, turned to the understudies, Brian Shaw and Merle Park, and said, here's something to do, see if you can work out what to do with these ribbons. And it was those two. Brian Shaw never danced Colas in the end because he wasn't a partner of any great strength, but he was there for those rehearsals, and those two came up with the Cat's Cradle. She was the second cast, Titania. His great friend Alexander Grant turned to him when the dream was being prepared and said, Fred, what's this? You're making 2 casts. You never announce two casts. You always are locked into one cast. And Ashton said, oh, it's all different now, I'm director. Sibley and Park were the first two Titanias, and to give each one a signature, he allowed them to have their own ways of doing the pirouette in the lullaby solo with the corps de ballet. En dehors pirouettes for Antoinette Sibley, en dedans for Merle Park. Have I got it the right way around?
En dehors for me.
En dehors. Thank you. I said she was in the original cast of Ondine. But I've mentioned the first period. She's Rendezvous, Patinage, she danced in Wedding Bouquet. Symphonic Variations, I remember her very well dancing the lead role. And if you can remember that brief solo with double sisson that the ballerina does halfway through Symphonic Variations, I would sit up in the amphitheater with my best friend Louise, and we were just starting to get so excited about musicality. And there was Merle Park, the most legendarily musical dancer of our day. And at one point, our elbows met as we were nudging each other so hard that it hurt. We'll come back to musicality because it is a central part of Merle Park's reputation and legend. Did you dance in Cinder Ballet? She said, I did, but I wasn't very good in it. Cinderella, she was a legendary Fairy Autumn, and of course Cinderella herself. And I so well remember, Fairy Autumn is on film, I think on 2 films. But I so well remember that when she first danced Cinderella, she came down the stairs in the famous entrance. Almost every other Cinderella looks ahead, and she looked up. And John Percival, I was new to Cinderella, but John Percival wrote, probably in Dance and Dancers, Merle Park is the kind of intelligent dancer who remembers, and this is what Fontaine had done. To look up changes the entrance. Of course, it makes it even harder. There you are just holding the prince's hand as you come down the staircase on point. But instead of looking as if you're looking at a mirror, actually you're just looking as if you're transported. And the look of relaxation throughout the upper body can be miraculous. In the 50s, particularly Birthday Offering, I don't know how many solos your generation danced in Birthday Offering. I certainly saw you dance the lead, but I think you did quite a few on the way up. Then from the 60s, Female Garde, Two Pigeons, The Dream, creating a role in Jazz Canada, and creating a role earlier in the Pas de Quatre added to Swan Lake in 1963. Quite a lot of younger people don't know the Pas de Quatre. To me, it was central to Swan Lake when I came to the ballet, and I miss it sorely. And particularly as Ashton's way of making a joke, a plaything with his dancers. He gave a solo to Merle Park, a solo to Antoinette Sibley, each based on a popular dance of the period. One's based on the twist, one's based on the cha-cha-cha. And that you can see the twist quite clearly when the ballerina on point goes like this with opposition throughout the body. Then in the 70s, Walk to the Paradise Garden, New Year's Eve 1977, Voices of Spring, done for a production of Fledermaus, now often done out of context. Before that, a pas de deux called Le Papillon, very rarely seen, but I so well remember. It was made for Merle Park and David Wall. It's revived for Merle Park and Wayne Eagling in 1977. I'd never seen virtuosity like it in pirouettes that came on in the coda. And I think I've heard through a chain of emails recently that the coda was either made for you and Wayne Eagling or revised then. I don't know. Well, we're hoping that the Ashton Foundation may also see if this one day can be reconstructed. It would be great. Then in the 1980s, this last solo, Le Chat Métamorphosé en Femme. So that's almost 30 years that Park and Ashton worked together. Originally, she was known as a soubrette, as a brilliant divertissement dancer, somebody who would come on, do a variation, tear the place up, and go off into the wings again. You mentioned Swan Lake to her, which she danced the lead many years. I saw her probably about 12 times with Dowell, Wall, Nureyev, others. Curiously, she doesn't mention the role of Odetta Deal, I interviewed her about a year ago, and she doesn't mention even the Pas de Quatre, which she created. What she particularly loved doing is the Neapolitan, coming on, tearing the place up, and off again. A great, great variation dancer. In Sleeping Beauty, a great Aurora, no question, and on film doing it, but also famous in some of the fairy variations like One and Above All. Well, you're on film in the Florestan and His Friends, but I was going to single out the Bluebird, pas de deux. Again, divertissement. Gradually, this dancer transformed herself and becomes a major ballerina. In the early 60s, she dances Aurora, Giselle. Then she's one of the first 4 Juliets in Macmillan's Romeo, and gradually becomes a dancer capable of tragedy, capable of major acting quality, clinched, not by Ashton perhaps, but by Macmillan in the role of Marie Lariche in Merle, 1978. And then she begins or develops a partnership with Macmillan that goes through Fin du Jour, Isadora, other ballets. I talked about the divertissement quality. I should just stress virtuosity. This was a dancer of phenomenal speed, terrific, above all, daring, just coming on, prepared in a partner's arms to be lifted up there, dropped, and then caught just 1 inch off the floor. Reckless. Monica Mason recently remembered how, when they were both young, she was asking Merle about how to do certain kinds of pirouettes, and Merle said, well, if there's a rake stage, then you take more of a risk, you lean, and falling is useful, and how you use falling. And that was a lesson for Monica Mason. Not every dancer thinks that way, of how you take risks and use them to create a new quality. Musicality. This is a hard thing on which to interview Merle Park, I have found. She gave an interview when I was still a fan in the early 70s, when she said, I don't call myself a musical dancer, I call myself a phrasical dancer. I thought, well, I think I understand what that means, and I certainly understood it from her dancing, but I wanted more. And so when I went to interview her, very exciting for me, she said almost straight away, I call myself a phrasical dancer, and didn't go further at first. And we went through her career, fascinating, learned everything. And then at the end, I said, of all those roles, we've been concentrating on the roles you created, but also other roles you've danced. Are there any now you'd like to coach? And she didn't mention Walk to the Paradise Garden, interestingly. She says straight away, oh, Les Rendezvous. And I had just been in New York looking at the film of her doing the lead in Les Rendezvous at the Ashton Farewell Gala in 1970. And there is a phenomenal phrase, which if you know Rendezvous, you know well, where she does piqué turn in attitude, double pirouette, then renversé. And with Merle Park, it is just breathtaking, as she is so playful at the end of it. And that was the phrase that Merle went for in conversation. She said, that's what I mean by phrasical, because you have to think of that sequence in terms of a phrase. You've got to know where you're beginning, how you're going to end, and then you have to think it through, and that's when you can work with the music. As I say, she thought, I think, that way about all of her roles. I don't know how calculated it was or how much it just was a dancer being at freedom with her conductor. She was legendary before my time in the 60s for working with John Lunchbury. I remember wonderful rapport with Ashley Lawrence. But then there was also a wonderful period where just for a few weeks, Robert Irving came back to the Royal Ballet, and perhaps the greatest single auroras I saw were the way that Merle Park and he worked together. Okay, now we're just going to talk a little about the pas de deux you're going to see. It's Ashton and love. Now, Ashton is, of course, known as the great poet of love, lyrical love. That's what you're going to see in Walk to the Paradise Garden. But I want to point out some of the oddities about Ashton. He's a man of contrasts. Perhaps all great artists are. If you read the biography of him, you'll realize that he was the least innocent man in the world. It ends with a wonderful speech that Margot Fontaine wrote for his memorial service. And she says, he once said to me he never felt he had ever been innocent. He had always seen through people, seen to their very hearts. If you read the beginning of the biography, you can see at the end of chapter 1 why that might have been so. There's a horrific moment where he confesses to being abused by all of his brothers. And that wasn't just a story he told Julie Kavanagh for the biography, he told Angus Wilson, it's another book too. That takes your breath away. But what's puzzling is that this man who might just to become dark and looking into what he had learnt the wrong way from his family, instead makes so many ballets that are about innocence. What we associate so often with Ashton is the innocent world of Les Patineurs, the innocent world of La Fille Malgardée, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Not all of them. Another paradox about him is that he is the greatest poet, choreographic poet of sex in the pas de deux. He starts to do it in The War, a ballet we can't now see, but in The Wanderer. He makes a pas de deux for Pamela May and Michael Soames. And simply the way that Michael Soames and Pamela May faced each other, looking deep into each other's eyes, with their hands on each other's buttocks. That seemed shocking in the 40s to people, that kind of intimacy. After the war, Roland Petit came from France and started to show a new kind of eroticism anyway, and straight away Ashton replied as if to say, well, I can trump that. And when he goes to New York, he makes Illuminations, which has a kind of Roland Petit eroticism where profane love and the poet roll on the floor. And at the end, it's quite implicit that orgasm has been reached because the poet goes to a pissoir and wipes himself off on stage with the pissoir. The next ballet he makes at Covent Garden is Daphnis and Chloe, which has what I believe is the most poetic depiction of sex in the repertory. It's not for Chloe, it's for Daphnis when he's being seduced by Lacanian. And she wraps her leg attitude front around him. You feel the friction between the bodies as he lifts her and lowers her, turns, and then she starts to arch right back, her arms expand, and then at the moment of orgasm, the foot quivers as she goes on turning faster and faster. There is no other such breathtaking moment that shows you the detail of sex as it affects the whole body. I became fascinated by this at the end of his life, and I thought, it's always female sexuality. And he is so alert to it. And in those days, I used to write notes to Julie Kavanagh and say, ask him this, ask him this. I didn't know him very well. And so I asked him about female sexuality, and I realized that another key ballet was Tiresias. He made a weird ballet, which wasn't much loved, in 1951, Tiresias, which is about which sex enjoys sex more. That's the Greek myth of Tiresias. Tiresias is the only person who can answer. He's been both man and woman. The answer is the woman, is the sex, who enjoys more than the man. And Tiresias can tell the two leading gods, Juno and Jupiter, this. Neither of them is very pleased to hear the result. But what a weird subject for a ballet. And so I asked Julie to ask Fred about this, and Fred at once said, oh, yes, well, I was always the woman, dear. And in a great sense, he was. All of those pas de deux, look at just the innocence of Fille Malgardée, the rapture with which Lise and Colas just look at each other, need to hang on each other, the amount of kisses in that ballet, the amount of embraces, and they aren't boring because they keep changing in style right throughout the ballet with a degree of trust and intimacy and rapture. We then go into a new kind of depth with the pas de deux in The Two Pigeons, and then The Dream, which is perhaps the most poetic love duet of them all, the most rapturous. I say that, and then you think of the various pas de deux in Month of the Country, and you wonder if I've just said the right thing. He goes on developing this. Another paradox about Ashton is we think of him as a classicist, and so often the bodies are upright. In most of monotones, most of symphonic variations, the dancers are vertical. There's one moment in monotones where the ballerinas sit, the three dancers sit on the floor, but it's brief. There's, I think, one moment in symphonic variations where one dancer kneels. It's brief. Normally they're vertical, radiating outwards. But he's quite prepared to make floor work if there's the right moment, the right subject matter. And in Walk to the Paradise Garden, we absolutely have the couple on the floor a great deal. And they're expressing love more with the upper body than with the lower. You're going to see. I've probably spoken longer than I should. This is critics for you. Just one note, because this will be the question that may be asked, and we will have questions at the end, by the way. It's often said that Ashton put a Fred step into every ballet. He put a Fred step into a great many ballets, and on at least one occasion, he realized he'd forgotten to put a Fred step in, and that was Illuminations, because he was away from home, New York City Ballet. And when it was staged on the Royal Ballet in 1981, Michael Soames looked at him and said, there's no Fred step, and they re-choreographed a section. Whenever Americans who know the Joffrey or the City Ballet version look at it and they say, I don't recognize the middle section, that's not the one I danced. So there are two versions of one ensemble in Illuminations. But actually, there are quite a lot of dances in which there is no Fred step. I've never spotted one in Rendezvous. I've never spotted one in Patineur. I was extremely proud and complacent when I spotted one in Wedding Bouquet before Anthony Dowell had. There is one in most of them. I think when he redid Romeo for London Festival Ballet, there had only been one Fred step. There's now 4 of them, and I suspect the other 3 got added in 1985 when he was adding for a company. Anyway, you're now going to see a pas de deux that has no Fred step, so don't ask where it is. Thank you very much.
Oh my God.